The microphone felt heavier in Toby's hand than it had all night. 25,000 people stretched out before him, in waves of denim and flags, their faces lit by stage lights that cut through the summer darkness like searchlights. He was mid-set, riding that groove where the band locks in and the crowd becomes part of the instrument, when the voice sliced through the space between songs. Sharp, deliberate, designed to wound. "Hey, Toby, how's it feel making millions off dead soldiers in Afghanistan?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun nobody expected to fire. Drums stopped. The bass died. Even the ambient noise of 25,000 people seemed to get sucked out of the venue in one collective breath. Toby stood there at center stage, perfectly still, his eyes scanning the front rows for the source. He found him quickly, a guy in his 30s, arms crossed, flanked by 3 or 4 others who'd clearly come with an agenda instead of an appetite for music. This wasn't the first time someone had taken a shot at him. Hell, it wasn't even the 100th. When you build a career on loving your country loud and without apology, you paint a target on yourself for people who think patriotism is performance and supporting the troops is propaganda. But this one landed different. Maybe because of where they were, a military town where half the crowd had family deployed. Maybe because of when it happened, right in the middle of a song about coming home. Or maybe because at that exact moment, the concert was being broadcast live via Armed Forces Network to forward operating bases across Afghanistan and Iraq, where soldiers were watching on mess hall screens after 16-hour patrols, hoping for a few minutes of home. Toby's jaw tightened. Not in anger exactly, but in that particular way a man's face changes when he realizes a moment has arrived that's been building for years. Every interview where he'd been asked to apologize for supporting the military. Every think piece calling him a warmonger for writing songs that honored service. Every time someone reduced the complexity of loving your country and mourning its costs into a bumper sticker argument. It all crystallized right there, under the lights with the heckler smirking like he'd just won something. The crowd started to react. Boos erupted from the back sections, someone near. The heckler shoved him. Security began moving through the aisles, but Toby raised one hand, not aggressive, just open, palm out. And somehow that simple gesture quieted 25,000 people faster than any shout could have. The silence that followed was the kind you feel in your chest, heavy and expectant. Toby stepped forward to the edge of the stage, his boots stopping just inches from where the platform dropped off. He looked down at the heckler with an expression that wasn't rage, wasn't even contempt. It was something closer to pity mixed with purpose. "You want to talk about how it feels?" His voice came through the PA system, measured and calm, with that Oklahoma gravel that made every word sound like it had weight behind it. "Let's talk about it." The heckler opened his mouth to respond, but Toby kept going, not louder, just clearer, like a man who'd been preparing for this conversation his whole life without knowing it. "It feels like being 22 years old and watching my dad work oil rigs until his hands bled so I could have a shot at something better. It feels like growing up in a town where your neighbor goes to war and doesn't come back, and everybody just shows up at the funeral and stands there not knowing what to say, because there aren't words big enough for that kind of loss. It feels like understanding real early that freedom isn't free. It's your buddy from high school. It's the kid who sat behind you in algebra. It's people who decided your life was worth more than theirs." The amphitheater was so quiet you could hear the wind moving through the open sections. Toby's voice dropped lower, more intimate, like he was talking to one person instead of thousands. "I've stood in hospital rooms at Walter Reed with guys who are learning to walk again on legs that aren't theirs. I've read letters from mothers whose sons played my songs on the way to missions they didn't come back from. I've looked Gold Star families in the eye and tried to find something to say that doesn't sound like nothing. You think this is about making money? Brother, you don't know me at all." In a forward operating base outside Kandahar, 100 soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder watching a screen mounted on plywood. Some were barely old enough to buy beer back home. Others were on their 4th deployment, their faces carrying the kind of wear that comes from seeing too much too young. They'd spent the day on patrol, scanning roadsides for IEDs, wondering which pile of trash might be the one. Now, bone-tired and still in their uniforms, they'd gathered for this. A few hours of music from someone who understood them, who'd never pretended to be one of them, but had never stopped honoring them either. When Toby started speaking to that heckler, something shifted in the room. Phones came out. Men who hadn't cried since basic training felt their throats tighten. Because what he was saying wasn't a speech. It was a translation of everything they'd been trying to explain to people back home for years. If you're the kind of person who believes in this country, who respects the men and women who defend it, who understands that Toby Keith isn't just an entertainer, but a voice for values that matter, then subscribe to this channel and support this work. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a comeback to a heckler. It's a testament to why some things are worth defending no matter who's watching. Back in the amphitheater, Toby was still standing at the edge of the stage, his guitar hanging from his shoulder like a part of his body. The heckler tried to shout something back, but his voice was already being swallowed by the growing rumble of the crowd. Toby didn't acknowledge it. He was past the heckler now, speaking to everyone else, speaking to the cameras broadcasting this to the bases overseas, speaking to the part of America that still believed in something bigger than themselves. Every show on this tour I meet families of fallen soldiers. Every ticket sold puts money toward veteran support organizations. Every time I step on this stage, I'm carrying the weight of people who trusted me to tell their story right. You came here tonight thinking you'd make me defend myself, but I don't need to defend this. These people here know what this is about. Those soldiers watching from the desert know what this is about. The only person in this building who doesn't understand is you. He paused, letting the words settle, then spoke again with a quietness that somehow carried more force than shouting ever could. I grew up believing that when someone serves, you honor them, not because of politics, not because of policy, but because they wrote a check to this country that their body might have to cash. That's not a talking point to me. That's my life. That's my music. And if you can't understand the difference between honoring sacrifice and exploiting it, then you're in the wrong place. The crowd erupted, but it wasn't celebration. It was catharsis. 25,000 people who'd been holding their breath, who'd been waiting to see if Toby would stoop to the heckler's level or rise above it, released everything at once. Some were crying. Some were shouting. Veterans in the audience stood at attention. A woman near the front held up a photo of her son in uniform, and the people around her made space, made sure Toby could see it. Security was finally reaching the heckler, guiding him and his group toward the exits. But Toby wasn't watching them leave. He was looking out at everyone else, at the faces that had come here for something the heckler would never understand, connection to something real, something that mattered beyond the noise of daily life. We're dedicating the rest of this show to every man and woman in uniform watching this tonight, Toby said, his voice rough now with emotion he wasn't trying to hide, and to every family waiting for them to come home, because that's what this has always been about. That's what it'll always be about. The band kicked into American Soldier, and the transformation was immediate. The amphitheater stopped being a concert venue and became something else, a church, a memorial, a gathering place for shared belief. People raised their phone lights, creating constellations in the darkness. Strangers embraced. Veterans saluted, their movements sharp and automatic, muscle memory from something that never really leaves you. Across Afghanistan and Iraq, on bases with names most Americans would never hear, soldiers watched the rest of that concert with something they hadn't felt in weeks, the knowledge that they weren't alone, that they weren't forgotten, that someone back home understood the weight they carried and honored it without flinching. Some of them would write about it later in letters home. Others would keep it private, locked in that place where you store moments that feel too important for words. But all of them felt it, that invisible thread connecting them to Toby, to that crowd, to the idea that their service meant something beyond the politics and the debates and the endless questions about whether it was worth it. In the days after, the video spread like wildfire through military communities. It was shared on veteran forums, posted in family support group chats, discussed in VFW halls and barracks and dinner tables where someone was missing. The mainstream media tried to frame it as a political moment, tried to extract some partisan lesson from it, but the people who mattered, the ones who served and the ones who loved them, knew better. This wasn't about left. It's all right. This was about the chasm between people who understand sacrifice and people who use it as ammunition for arguments they'll never have to back up with anything real. Toby Keith had been confronted by cynicism and responded with truth. He'd been challenged by someone who saw soldiers as statistics and replied by honoring them as human beings. He didn't destroy the heckler with clever wordplay or rehearsed zingers. He simply stood firm in what he'd always believed, spoke it plainly, and let the weight of sincerity do what mockery never could: reveal the difference between performance and conviction. Years would pass, and veterans would still reference that night, not because of what Toby said to one angry guy in a crowd, but because of what he said to all of them, to the deployed and the returned, to the families waiting and the families grieving, to everyone who'd ever felt like their service was being reduced to a talking point in someone else's argument. He'd given them language for something they'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. He'd stood in the gap when it would have been easier to ignore the provocation and move on. And in doing so, he'd proven that his music wasn't a brand or a gimmick. It was a calling lived out loud without apology. The heckler probably thought he'd made his point that night, probably went home believing he'd challenged something that needed challenging, but he'd actually done something else entirely. He'd given Toby the opportunity to show in front of thousands of witnesses and thousands more watching from war zones exactly who he was when the lights got hot and the questions got hard. And the answer, the one that echoed through that amphitheater and across oceans into the hearts of people who needed to hear it, was simple. A man who meant every word he sang, who honored every person he claimed to honor, and who would defend that commitment as fiercely as the soldiers he sang about defended their country. If what you just witnessed moved you, if you believe Toby Keith represents something worth preserving in American culture, then leave your like right now and subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do. We tell the stories that matter, the moments when conviction meets challenge and shows what it's made of. Don't let this be the last time you hear truth spoken this clearly.